The cold was relentless in Shard's Edge. Not the kind that nipped at extremities or flushed cheeks red, but the sort that settled into bones and took residence there. A permanent houseguest that never left, even when indoors. Under the massive glass dome that encased the city, temperatures were regulated to preserve energy, just warm enough to prevent death, cold enough to remind everyone of their precarious existence. Jalen Rohr moved through the empty streets with practiced indifference, hands buried deep in the pockets of his frayed thermal coat, shoulders hunched against the perpetual chill. His breath created small clouds that dissipated quickly in the dim light of the dome's artificial evening. The city hadn't seen natural sunlight in decades, not since the atmospheric collapse had forced humanity into these domed enclaves. Desperate measures for desperate times. "Late again, Rohr," came the crackling voice through his comm unit. Supervisor Dench, as warm as the city itself. "Maintenance on level 6 delayed me." Jalen lied easily, his voice flat. "Circuitry issues." A grunt of acknowledgement was the only response. No one bothered to verify such claims anymore. The city's infrastructure was failing piece by piece, and no one had the resources or will to fix it properly. Band-aids on hemorrhaging wounds. Jalen had once been an architect, designing spaces that maximized both beauty and function. Now he was just another night shift worker at a control station, monitoring system readouts that grew more alarming with each passing month. Shard's Edge was dying, just like every other domed city. It was only a matter of time. He swiped his ID at the entrance to Station 19, the doors wheezing open reluctantly. Inside, the control room was a cacophony of blinking lights, soft alarms, and the persistent hum of machinery fighting entropy. His relief. Marlowe was already standing, eager to escape to whatever passed for comfort in his prefab unit. "System's been glitching all night," Marlowe said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Sector 4 heat regulators keep dropping below threshold. I've reset them 6 times already." Jalen nodded, sliding into the worn chair, still warm from Marlowe's body. "I'll keep an eye on it." "Yeah, whatever. Good luck." Marlowe was gone before Jalen could respond, the doors closing behind him with a wheeze and a clunk. Alone now, Jalen settled into the familiar routine. Check the atmospheric readings, monitor the dome integrity sensors, reset the glitching heat regulators in Sector 4. The work was mindless, which left his thoughts free to wander. Never a good thing. He'd learned long ago that survival in Shard's Edge meant keeping your mind occupied with the present, never dwelling on the past or hoping for the future. 8 hours later, as artificial dawn began to brighten the dome, Jalen completed his shift handover to morning crew and stepped back into the cold streets. His prefab unit was 15 minutes away by foot. 15 minutes of exposure to the elements and to the other desperate souls who called this purgatory home. The residential sectors were never truly asleep, but at this hour, they were quieter. Most were either already at work or still recovering from whatever method they'd chosen to forget their reality the night before. Jalen kept his eyes forward, his pace steady. That was the unwritten rule in Shard's Edge. Mind your business. Keep moving. Survive another day. It was 3 blocks from his unit when he saw her. She stood beneath one of the sputtering light posts, thin arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt to preserve warmth. Even from a distance, Jalen could see she was shivering violently. Her skin had a faint bluish tint that stood out against the drab grays and browns of the city, the unmistakable mark of an off-worlder. Alien, not human, though humanoid enough to navigate human spaces. Normally, Jalen would have kept walking. That was the rule. Mind your business. Keep moving. Survive. But something made him slow his steps. Perhaps it was the way she stood. Pride, evident even in her desperation. Perhaps it was the hollow look in her large, slightly too wide-set eyes, a look he recognized from his own reflection. Warmth, she said as he approached, her voice carrying the distinctive musical undertone of the cerulean species. Food, shelter. She gestured to herself, the universal offering that had become all too common in the dying city. For you, one night. Jalen stopped completely now, studying her. Her clothing was inadequate for the dome's temperatures, some kind of thin jumpsuit meant for the regulated environments of space stations, not the harsh conditions of Shard's Edge. Her blue-tinged skin was drawn tight over prominent cheekbones, and her hair, a silvery shade that caught what little light existed, was matted against her scalp. She was starving, freezing, desperate, just like everyone else in this god-forsaken place. "How long have you been here?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Her eyes, entirely black, without discernible pupils, widened slightly. Perhaps she was surprised too, that he'd asked anything at all, rather than simply accepting or rejecting her offer. 3 cycles, she replied, her thin arms tightening around her torso. Ship. Damaged. Crew left. Each word seemed to cost her energy she couldn't spare. 3 cycles. 3 days in Shard's Edge conditions without proper clothing or shelter. It was a miracle she was still standing. Jalen should walk away. He knew this. Everyone in Shard's Edge had their own problems, their own desperate battles for survival. Taking on someone else's burden was a luxury no one could afford. Yet he found himself speaking. "I have food," he said quietly, "and heat. Come on." Her expression didn't change, but she straightened slightly, a wariness entering her posture. In Shard's Edge, kindness was often the prelude to cruelty. "No payment," Jalen clarified, understanding her hesitation. "Just food and warmth. Then you go where you want." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, with a single nod that might have been resignation or calculation, she fell into step beside him. They walked the remaining blocks in silence, 2 shadows among many in the cold light of morning. Jalen's prefab unit was like thousands of others in the residential sector, a modular box stacked among identical boxes, distinguished only by the unit number stenciled on the door. 4872. Home, such as it was. He pressed his palm to the scanner, and the door slid open with a hiss. Warm air rushed out to meet them, not comfortable by any standard, but a stark contrast to the outside chill. The alien girl's sharp intake of breath was the only indication of her relief as she stepped over the threshold. Jalen followed, closing the door behind them. The prefab was a single room with partitioned areas serving different functions. A narrow bed against one wall, a compact kitchenette, a small seating area with a table that doubled as a workstation, and a bathroom cubicle in the corner. Everything was functional, nothing was beautiful, the antithesis of what Jalen had once designed. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the 2 chairs at the table. She complied, her movements stiff from cold. Jalen moved to the kitchenette, opening a cabinet to retrieve his carefully rationed food supplies. He didn't look at her as he worked, heating water in a pot and adding dehydrated protein and the few precious real vegetable flakes he'd been saving. "It's not much," he said, stirring the thickening mixture. "But it's hot." When he finally turned with 2 bowls, he found her exactly as he'd left her, perched on the edge of the chair, hands folded in her lap, back straight, despite her obvious exhaustion. The blue tint of her skin had begun to fade slightly in the relative warmth of the prefab. He set a bowl before her, along with a spoon, then took the seat opposite. For a moment, she didn't move, her black eyes fixed on the steaming food with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. "It's safe for your kind," Jalen said, taking a spoonful of his own portion. "Standard protein base?" Only then did she reach for the spoon, her slender fingers wrapping around it with careful precision. The first bite disappeared into her mouth, and her eyes closed briefly, the only indication of her hunger or relief. They ate in silence. Jalen watched surreptitiously as color gradually returned to her face, the desperate edge of her movements softening as the food and warmth began to restore her. When she finished, she set the spoon down with the same deliberate care with which she'd picked it up. "Thank you," she said, the musical undertone of her voice stronger now. "Why help?" Jalen considered the question, scraping the last of his meal from the bowl before answering. "I don't know," he admitted finally. It was the truth. He couldn't explain the impulse that had made him stop, that had brought this stranger into his private space. In the years since he'd drifted into Shard's Edge, he'd mastered the art of indifference, a necessary skill in a place where attachment was a liability and compassion a luxury few could afford. "What's your name?" he asked, changing the subject. "Cyrene," she replied. Then, with a slight tilt of her head, "In your language, closest sound." "Cyrene," he repeated, the name unfamiliar on his tongue. "I'm Jalen." She nodded once, acknowledging the introduction. Her eyes traveled around the small space, taking in the sparse furnishings, the patched wall panels, the single window with its permanently fogged view of the identical prefab unit across the narrow alley. "You work?" she asked. "Control station," he said. "Night shift monitoring systems." He didn't mention his former life, his former skills. Those belonged to a different person in a different world. "Sleep now?" she asked, and there was a new tension in her posture, a readiness to stand, to leave if necessary. Jalen glanced at the narrow bed, then back at her. "You can rest there," he said, nodding toward it. "I'll take the chair." The suspicion in her eyes didn't diminish. "Why?" "Why indeed?" Jalen ran a hand through his short, dark hair, suddenly aware of how strange this situation was, how far outside his carefully constructed routine. "Because you need it more than I do," he said simply. "And then you'll go, like we agreed." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite trust, but perhaps the recognition that he meant what he said. "Where will you go?" he asked, gathering their empty bowls. "Find work," she said, her slim shoulders lifting in a slight shrug. "Fix things. Good with machines. Then passage off-world." Jalen set the bowls in the small sink, turning on the tap to rinse them. "Not many ships leaving Shard's Edge these days," he said, "and fewer looking for passengers." "We'll find way," she replied, and there was steel beneath the melodic tones, determination that had likely kept her alive these past 3 days. Jalen didn't argue. Instead, he gestured again to the bed. "Rest. I have shift again tonight. You can stay until then." She hesitated only briefly before crossing to the bed, sitting on its edge with the same careful movements that characterized everything she did. Watching him with those bottomless black eyes, she slowly reclined, her body rigid, even in the horizontal position. Jalen moved to the chair, settling himself as comfortably as possible. He had no illusions about sleeping well in this position, but he'd gone without proper rest before. "Thank you," Cyrene said again, her voice already growing heavy with exhaustion. "Not expected. Kindness here." "No," Jalen agreed quietly. "It's not." He watched as her eyes finally closed, her breathing gradually slowing and deepening. Only in sleep did the tension leave her body, revealing how truly exhausted she had been. Jalen leaned his head back against the wall, closing his own eyes. He didn't expect to sleep, but somewhere between one thought and the next, consciousness slipped away. When he woke, the prefab's automatic lighting had dimmed to simulate evening, and something was different. It took his sleep-fogged brain a moment to identify what had changed. The persistent hiss from the environmental control valve, a sound so constant he normally didn't even register it, had stopped. He straightened in the chair, wincing at the stiffness in his neck and back, and looked toward the bed. It was empty. Panic flared briefly before he spotted her. Cyrene was crouched near the wall panel that housed the environmental controls, a small tool in her slender, blue-tinged fingers. The tool, he realized with surprise, had come from his own repair kit, which was open on the floor beside her. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. She glanced up, those black eyes unreadable. "Fixing," she said simply. "Valve leaking, wasting heat." Jalen stood, crossing the small space to look over her shoulder. Sure enough, she had dismantled the control panel and was carefully adjusting the valve that had been leaking for months. A small, but persistent problem he'd learned to live with. Like so many other broken things in Shard's Edge. "How did you know it was leaking?" he asked. "Sound," she replied, her attention back on her work. "Different pattern than normal function. Inefficient." Her fingers moved with surprising dexterity, tightening connections and realigning components with practiced ease. Within minutes, she had reassembled the panel and closed it. "Test," she instructed, nodding toward the control pad on the wall. Jalen stepped over and adjusted the temperature setting. The system hummed to life, but the persistent hiss was gone, replaced by the smoother sound of properly functioning machinery. "It's fixed," he said, unable to keep the surprise from his voice. Cyrene nodded once, satisfaction evident in the slight lift of her chin. "Payment," she said, gathering the tools and returning them meticulously to the kit. "For food, for rest." "You didn't have to," Jalen began, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Balance," she insisted. "No debt." Understanding dawned slowly. In her mind, she had now paid for what he'd given her. They were even, no obligations remaining on either side. It was a transaction, not charity. Her pride remained intact. "Thank you," he said, nodding toward the repaired valve. "It's good work." Something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps, at the acknowledgement of her skill. Then it was gone, replaced by the careful neutrality she maintained. "You work tonight?" she asked, rising fluidly to her feet. Jalen glanced at the time display on the wall. He had 4 hours before his shift began. "Yes," he confirmed. She nodded, gathering herself as if preparing to leave, though her reluctance was evident in the slight hesitation of her movements. Outside, the temperature would be dropping as the dome's night cycle began. She would be back where he'd found her, cold, hungry, vulnerable. The words came before he had fully formed the thought. "The valve isn't the only thing broken here," he said. "If you want to stay longer, fix more things. I could provide food, shelter." Her head tilted slightly, those alien eyes studying him with renewed intensity. "Why?" she asked again. Jalen struggled to articulate an answer that made sense, even to himself. "Because you have skills," he said finally. "And I have broken things. A fair exchange." It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either, and it was a reason she might accept without seeing it as pity. For a long moment, she didn't respond, her expression unreadable. Then, with a deliberate motion, she set the repair kit back on the floor. "Show me broken things," she said. Over the next few hours, Jalen pointed out the prefab's various malfunctions. The shower control that only produced scalding water, the food storage unit that froze everything regardless of settings, the lighting panel that flickered incessantly in the bathroom. Cyrene tackled each with the same focused efficiency she'd shown with the valve, asking few questions, working with quiet competence. By the time Jalen needed to prepare for his shift, the prefab was functioning better than it had in years. "I'll bring food when I return," he said, pulling on his thermal coat. "You can stay, if you want." Cyrene, sitting at the table cleaning his tools with meticulous care, looked up. "We'll stay," she said after a brief pause. "More to fix tomorrow." Jalen nodded, an unexpected relief washing through him. "The door will recognize your palm print now," he said, having added her to the security system. "Come and go if you need to." She acknowledged this with a slight inclination of her head, then returned to her task. signaling the end of the conversation. As Jalen made his way through the cold streets toward Station 19, he questioned his own actions, bringing a stranger, an alien, into his home, giving her access, trusting her with his few possessions. It was reckless by Shard's Edge standards, potentially dangerous. Yet something about Cyrene's precise movements, her careful words, her insistence on balance and payment, had disarmed his usual caution. There was a straightforwardness to her that was rare in the Dome, where most interactions were layered with deceit or desperation. His shift passed with the usual monotony, punctuated by the familiar alarms and system resets. But for once, his thoughts weren't confined to the bleak present. They kept returning to the blue-skinned woman in his prefab, wondering what else she might be fixing in his absence. When dawn came again, Jalen stopped at the market sector, using precious credits to purchase fresh protein and, in a moment of extravagance, a small packet of real fruit, dried apples imported from one of the agricultural domes, a luxury he hadn't afforded himself in months. The prefab was quiet when he returned, but the air felt different, cleaner somehow, as if the environmental systems were working more efficiently. Cyrene was asleep on the floor beside the bed, a makeshift pallet of spare blankets beneath her. Jalen set the food down quietly, trying not to wake her, but her eyes opened at the soft sound, instantly alert. "You didn't take the bed," he observed, keeping his voice low. "Your bed," she replied simply, rising to her feet in one fluid motion. No trace of sleep lingered in her posture or expression. "I brought food," Jalen said, unpacking the items on the small counter. "Including this." He held up the packet of dried apples, a small offering. Cyrene approached cautiously, her black eyes fixed on the unfamiliar item. "What is?" "Fruit. Apples." He opened the packet, extending it toward her. "Try one." She hesitated only briefly before selecting a dried slice, examining it with the same focused attention she gave to mechanical components. Then she placed it in her mouth. The change that came over her face was subtle but profound, a widening of those alien eyes, a softening of the perpetual tension around her mouth. For the first time, Jalen saw something like pleasure in her expression. "Good?" he asked, though the answer was evident. She nodded, reaching for another piece with slightly less reserve. "Sweet," she said, the musical quality of her voice more pronounced. "Like home food." It was the first personal detail she had shared, the first reference to a life before Shard's Edge. Jalen didn't press, instead, beginning to prepare a proper meal with the protein he'd purchased. "I fixed more," Cyrene said after a moment, gesturing toward the prefab systems. "Air filtration improved, water pressure balanced." "I noticed," Jalen replied, glancing up from his work. "The air feels different." A hint of satisfaction crossed her features, quickly controlled. "Found error in inventory system 2, she added. "At station." Jalen paused, the knife in his hand stilling. "What do you mean?" "Access terminal," she explained, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "While you slept, found supply discrepancy in Sector 4, missing coolant redirected to private storage, not in system record." Jalen set the knife down carefully. "You hacked into the control station systems from here." She tilted her head slightly, confused by his reaction. "Interface simple. Wanted to help." "Cyrene," Jalen said slowly. "That's a restricted system. If anyone traced that access back here—" "No trace," she interrupted, a note of pride entering her voice. "Clean entry, clean exit, shadow protocol." Jalen ran a hand through his hair, torn between alarm and amazement. "Why would you risk that?" Her expression sobered. "Payment," she said, as if it were obvious. "For food, for shelter." "Fixing my prefab was more than enough payment," Jalen said. "You didn't need to—" "Unequal exchange," she countered. "Shelter saves life. Small repairs insufficient." The alien logic was both frustrating and oddly touching. In her mind, she was still repaying a debt, and the magnitude of that debt required something beyond minor household repairs. "What exactly did you find?" Jalen asked, deciding to focus on the information rather than the method of obtaining it. "Coolant for dome systems," Cyrene explained. "Large quantities diverted to private storage facility in Sector 7. No authorization code. No record in main system." Jalen's brow furrowed. Sector 7 was primarily abandoned buildings and obsolete infrastructure, a part of the dome that had been gradually emptied as the population dwindled and resources became more concentrated. Few had reason to go there, which would make it an ideal location for unauthorized activities. "Someone's stealing coolant," he murmured, thinking aloud. "But why? It's not valuable outside the dome systems." "Stockpiling," Cyrene suggested. "Preparation." "For what?" She met his eyes directly, her gaze unflinching. "Collapse." The word hung between them, heavy with implication. Everyone in Shard's Edge knew the dome was failing. It was a fact of life, like the cold or the dim light. But few spoke of it directly, as if naming the inevitable might hasten its arrival. "Coolant keeps critical systems functioning," Jalen said, thinking through the implications. "If someone's hoarding it—" "Selfish survival," Cyrene finished for him. "Few benefit, many suffer." Jalen turned back to the food preparation, his movements mechanical as his mind processed this new information. Theft was common in Shard's Edge, but usually small-scale: food, medicine, personal items. The systematic diversion of critical dome resources was something else entirely. It suggested organization, planning, and a disregard for collective survival. "Did you see who's responsible?" he asked. "Access codes traced to MK Corporation," Cyrene replied. "Private security contractor." Jalen's stomach tightened. The MKs, as they were commonly known, were ostensibly a security firm that helped maintain order in certain sectors of the dome. In practice, they were little more than sanctioned thugs who extracted protection payments from residents and businesses. They had influence with dome administration and a reputation for brutal efficiency. "We should forget you saw anything," Jalen said, his voice low. "The MKs are dangerous if they found out someone was tracking their activities." "Already done," Cyrene said, a hint of defiance in her tone. "Left message in system, anonymous, warning." Jalen stared at her, disbelief mingling with a grudging admiration. "You warned the administration about the theft?" "Correct action," she said simply. "Resource theft endangers all." There was a moral certainty in her statement that struck Jalen forcefully. In Shard's Edge, where survival often meant compromise and looking the other way, such clarity was rare. "They might trace it back," he warned. Cyrene shook her head slightly. "Impossible. Clean trail." Jalen wanted to believe her. But years in Shard's Edge had taught him that nothing was truly secure, and powerful entities like the MKs had ways of discovering inconvenient truths. "Just be careful," he said finally, returning to the meal preparation. "The MKs don't appreciate interference." They ate in relative silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. The dried apples were shared between them, a small, bright note in the otherwise utilitarian meal. When they finished, Jalen finally asked the question that had been growing in his mind. "How did you end up here, in Shard's Edge?" Cyrene was silent for so long that Jalen thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, the musical undertone subdued. "Ship damaged in asteroid field," she said. "Emergency landing at Domeport. Crew. Not patient with repair time. Left when Dome authorities demanded payment for docking." "They abandoned you?" Jalen asked, disbelief coloring his tone. "Contract fulfilled," she replied with a small shrug that didn't match the shadow that crossed her face. "My section of journey completed. No obligation to wait." "That's—" Jalen began, then stopped himself. He had been about to say cruel, but realized the futility of imposing human moral standards on what was clearly an alien contractual arrangement. "Different cultures, different rules," Cyrene said, as if reading his thoughts. "No use for anger now." Jalen nodded, acknowledging the practical wisdom in her words. "What will you do? Long term, I mean." "Find ship leaving Dome," she said, the determination returning to her voice. "Work passage to Centauri Hub. Many opportunities there." "And until then?" She met his gaze steadily. "Fix things. Earn keep." The simplicity of her plan was appealing, though Jalen knew the reality would be more complicated. Ships rarely docked at Shard's Edge anymore, and those that did were seldom looking for passengers or crew. But he didn't voice these doubts. Her determination deserved respect, not discouragement. "You're welcome to stay here," he found himself saying, "until you find passage." Again, that measuring look from those bottomless black eyes. "Why offer?" Jalen considered several possible answers before settling on the truth. "Because it's less cold with you here," he said quietly. "And I don't mean the temperature." Something shifted in her expression, a subtle softening that transformed her alien features into something unexpectedly vulnerable. For a moment, the careful neutrality she maintained slipped, revealing a glimpse of the person beneath the survival mechanism. "Understood," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll stay." That night, when Jalen prepared for his shift, there was a new tension in the air between them, not unpleasant, but charged with unspoken possibilities. As he pulled on his coat, Cyrene approached, holding something out to him. "Take," she said, "for protection." It was a small device, no larger than his thumb, constructed from what appeared to be parts salvaged from his repair kit, and perhaps components from her own possessions. "What is it?" he asked, accepting the object carefully. "Signal scrambler," she explained. "Masks biosignature, useful if problems come." The gift was practical, utilitarian, yet in the context of their developing relationship, it carried deeper significance. She was concerned for his safety. She had used her skills to provide protection. "Thank you," Jalen said, pocketing the device with more care than its simple appearance might warrant. "I'll be back at dawn." She nodded, that now familiar single acknowledgement. "We'll be here." The night shift passed with excruciating slowness. Jalen found his thoughts constantly returning to the prefab, to Cyrene, to the strange new dynamic that was developing between them. It had been years since he'd shared his space with anyone, longer still since he'd felt any connection worth nurturing. Yet, here he was, counting the hours until he could return to a prefab that suddenly felt more like a home than a shelter. As artificial dawn brightened the dome, Jalen completed his handover and stepped into the cold streets with a lightness he hadn't felt in ages. He stopped again at the market, using more of his carefully saved credits to purchase food, not just the basics this time, but small luxuries, real vegetables, a protein variety pack, and more of the dried fruit that had brought such pleasure to Cyrene's austere features. He was 3 blocks from the prefab when he noticed something was wrong. The street was too quiet, the usual early morning movements of residents conspicuously absent. A sense of watchfulness hung in the air, raising the hair on the back of his neck. Instinctively, Jalen reached into his pocket, fingers closing around the signal scrambler Cyrene had given him. He activated it with a press of his thumb, feeling a slight vibration as it came to life. He continued walking, maintaining his pace while his eyes scanned the surroundings with heightened awareness. Nothing seemed obviously amiss, yet the sense of wrongness persisted. The prefab building came into view, identical to all the others on the street. Unit 4872, his small corner of the dying city. As he approached, the door slid open before he could reach the scanner. Cyrene stood in the doorway, her posture tense, those black eyes wider than usual. "Inside," she said urgently. her musical voice pitched low. "Quickly!" Jalen stepped past her into the prefab, the door sliding shut behind him with a hiss that seemed louder than normal in the tense atmosphere. "What's happening?" he asked, setting down the food packages. "Searched," Cyrene replied, moving to the window and peering cautiously through the permanently fogged glass. "While you gone, MKs. Looking for alien. For me." A cold weight settled in Jalen's stomach. "How do you know?" "Watched from maintenance shaft," she explained, gesturing toward a panel in the ceiling that Jalen had never noticed was removable. 3 men, armed, checking prefabs one by one. "They must have traced your access to the station systems," Jalen said, his mind racing. "Or someone reported seeing you." Cyrene shook her head slightly. "Not about system. Heard them speak. Looking for blue-skin runaway. For merchandise." The implication was clear, and it sent a surge of anger through Jalen. The MKs weren't security at all. They were traffickers, treating sentient beings as commodities. Cyrene wasn't the first vulnerable off-worlder to find herself in their clutches. It seemed. "We need to get you out of here," Jalen said, glancing around the small space, as if a solution might materialize from the sparse furnishings. "If they're searching systematically." "Too late," Cyrene interrupted, her gaze fixed on something through the window. "Coming back." Jalen joined her at the window, peering through the fogged glass. Sure enough, 3 figures in the distinctive dark uniforms of MK security were making their way down the street, checking prefab units as they went. "They'll be here in minutes," he murmured. Cyrene turned to him, her expression resolute. Must hide, or fight. The choice was stark, but the reality of Shard's Edge made it simple. Hiding would only delay the inevitable. The MKs had resources and authority that Jalen couldn't hope to counter through official channels. "We fight," he decided, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "But we need an advantage." Cyrene nodded once, her eyes gleaming with what might have been approval. "Darkness," she said. "My vision superior in low light. Theirs is not." It was a tactical observation, practical and detached, but it sparked a plan in Jalen's mind. "The environmental controls," he said, moving quickly to the wall panel she had repaired. "If we redirect power from lighting to heat suppression." "Cold and dark," Cyrene finished, following his logic immediately. "Disorienting for humans. Less so for me." Jalen's fingers moved over the control panel, accessing the prefab's basic systems. "Can you do something about the door scanner? Make it malfunction when they try to force entry." Cyrene was already retrieving tools from the repair kit. "Can rig surge. Shock on unauthorized entry attempt." They worked with urgent efficiency, Cyrene modifying the door security while Jalen reprogrammed the environmental systems. It was a desperate plan, born of necessity rather than confidence. But it was all they had. "Done," Cyrene announced, closing the access panel beside the door. "We'll trigger on forced entry." "Same here," Jalen said, stepping back from the controls. "Ready to activate on your signal." They stood in the center of the prefab, facing the door, listening to the approaching footsteps and muffled voices in the corridor outside. "Jalen," Cyrene said suddenly, his name unfamiliar yet right on her alien tongue. "Why help me? True reason." The question caught him off guard, especially given the timing, but he understood its importance. If they were about to fight together, possibly die together, truth mattered. "Because when I saw you standing in the cold," he said slowly, "I recognized something. Not just desperation or need, dignity, resilience." He met her gaze directly. "I wanted to be the kind of person who still sees those things, who still responds to them." Something shifted in her expression, a deepening, a recognition. "Understood," she said softly. Then, with a slight motion of her head toward the door, "They come." Heavy footsteps stopped outside the prefab. There was a pause, Then the harsh sound of a scanner being activated, an override device attempting to force the door open. "Now," Cyrene whispered. Jalen pressed the sequence on the environmental panel. Instantly, the prefab was plunged into darkness as the power redirected. The temperature began to drop precipitously, creating a fog of rapidly cooling air. A crackling sound came from the door, followed by a muffled curse. Cyrene's surge trap had activated, delivering a shock to whoever had attempted to bypass the security scanner. "Won't stop them long," Jalen murmured, moving to position himself beside the door. Cyrene took up a position on the opposite side, her outline barely visible in the darkness. "Ready," she replied, her voice steady. The next attempt came with more force, a mechanical whine as a more powerful override was applied to the door mechanism. This time, the security held for only a moment before failing. The door slid open with a reluctant hiss. Cold fog rolled out to meet the intruders, obscuring vision and creating momentary confusion. A beam of light cut through the darkness as one of the MKs activated a handheld illuminator. "What the hell?" a gruff voice muttered. "System malfunction?" "Check it anyway," another voice commanded. The scanner showed life signs before it went dark. Two figures stepped cautiously into the prefab, weapons drawn. A third remained in the doorway, keeping watch on the corridor. In the near-total darkness, with the fog swirling around their feet, the MKs moved with the hesitation of those who know they've entered hostile territory, but can't identify the threat. Their breath formed white clouds in the rapidly cooling air. Jalen remained perfectly still, pressed against the wall, waiting for Cyrene's lead. In the low light, he could just make out her form across from him, a shadow among shadows, utterly motionless. The beam of light swept across the prefab, illuminating the sparse furnishings, the small kitchen area, the narrow bed. It passed over Jalen, then jerked back, catching him in its glare. "There!" the MK with the light shouted, raising his weapon. But before he could fire, Cyrene moved. She launched herself from her position with startling speed, a blur of motion in the darkness. The light went spinning as she struck the man's arm with precise force, a sharp crack indicating broken bone. The second MK turned toward the commotion, firing blindly into the darkness. The energy pulse from his weapon illuminated the scene in a brief, surreal flash. Cyrene already moving to her next target, the first MK crumpling to the floor. Jalen seized the moment of confusion to tackle the second gunman from behind, driving him forward into the wall with all his strength. The impact knocked the weapon from the man's grip, sending it skittering across the floor. The third MK, still in the doorway, raised his communicator. "Base, we need backup at Unit 48. His transmission cut off abruptly as Cyrene reached him, her slender hand striking with impossible precision at the juncture of his neck and shoulder. He collapsed without another sound, the communicator falling from nerveless fingers. In the sudden quiet, Jalen could hear only his own ragged breathing and the soft hum of the prefab systems slowly returning to normal function as the emergency protocols reset. "Lights," Cyrene said calmly, as if they hadn't just incapacitated three armed men. "Need to see damage." Jalen fumbled for the control panel, restoring power to the lighting system. As illumination returned to the prefab, he surveyed the aftermath of their brief, violent encounter. 3 MK security officers lay unconscious on the floor. The first had a clearly broken arm, the second, a bloody nose from his impact with the wall, the third, unmarked but completely still. "Are they?" Jalen began, suddenly aware of the potential consequences of what they'd done. "Alive," Cyrene confirmed, kneeling to check the pulse of the man she had struck last. "Nerve cluster disruption. Temporary." Relief washed through Jalen, followed immediately by the cold reality of their situation. They had assaulted MK security officers in Shard's Edge. That was essentially a death sentence. "We need to go," he said, already moving to gather essential supplies. "Now," before they wake up or their backup arrives. Cyrene was ahead of him, collecting the fallen weapons and communicators. "Need plan," she said, her movements efficient and purposeful. "Where go?" Jalen's mind raced through the limited options. Staying in Shard's Edge was suicide. The MKs had too much influence, too many eyes. But leaving the dome meant facing the hostile environment outside, with minimal resources and no clear destination. "Ridge Camp," he said suddenly, the name surfacing from memory. "It's a settlement outside the dome perimeter. Mostly scavengers and dome maintenance workers. Independent." "Distance?" Cyrene asked, securing the weapons in a makeshift harness she had created from parts of his repair kit. 10 kilometers beyond the east airlock," Jalen replied, stuffing clothes and food supplies into a durable bag. "Through the transition zone." The transition zone was the area immediately surrounding the dome, partially sheltered by its microclimate, but not fully enclosed. It was dangerous. Unstable weather patterns, poor visibility, the occasional desperate outcast, but navigable with proper preparation. "Time limited," Cyrene observed, glancing at the unconscious MKs. "Need disguise. Need access codes for airlock." Jalen looked at the fallen security officers, a plan forming. "We'll take their uniforms," he said, "and their credentials should get us through the airlock without too many questions." Cyrene nodded, already stripping equipment from the nearest unconscious figure. "What about them?" she asked, nodding toward the 3 men. Jalen considered briefly. Killing them would be the safest option. No witnesses, no immediate pursuit. But despite everything Shard's Edge had taken from him, he wasn't ready to cross that line. "We'll lock them in the maintenance shaft," he decided. "By the time someone finds them, we'll be long gone." They worked quickly, efficiently, with the unspoken coordination of those who share a common purpose. The MKs were secured in the ceiling shaft, their communications disabled, their uniforms altered hastily to conceal Cyrene's distinctive blue skin and to fit their different frames, provided a basic disguise. As they prepared to leave, Jalen took one last look around the prefab. This small, sterile space had been his home for years, a shelter, if never truly a sanctuary. Now he was leaving it behind, along with the careful routine he had constructed to keep himself numb and functioning in this dying city. "Regret?" Cyrene asked quietly, observing his hesitation. Jalen shook his head. "No," he said, surprised by the truth of it. "Nothing worth keeping here." She nodded once, understanding in those alien eyes. "Ready then." "Ready," Jalen confirmed, hefting the bag of supplies onto his shoulder. "Let's go." They moved through the corridors of the residential sector with deliberate purpose, their stolen MK uniforms providing a buffer of authority that kept other residents at a distance. No one looked too closely at security personnel in Shard's Edge. It was safer that way. The east airlock was located in a less populated area of the dome, primarily used for maintenance access and occasional supply transfers. As they approached, Jalen felt a growing tension in his shoulders. This was the most dangerous part of their escape plan. If the airlock security recognized that their credentials were stolen, or if an alert had already been issued. "Normal pace," Cyrene murmured beside him, sensing his anxiety. "Normal posture, authority and movement." Jalen took a deep breath, consciously relaxing his stance and adopting the confident stride of someone who belonged exactly where they were. Cyrene did the same, her natural grace making the performance more convincing than his. The airlock was manned by a single bored-looking guard, who barely glanced up from his terminal as they approached. "Maintenance inspection," Jalen said, his voice gruff, flashing the stolen credentials. "Exterior sensor array." The guard nodded absently, more interested in whatever was on his screen than in scrutinizing their identities. He pressed a sequence on his console, and the inner airlock door slid open. "Sign out when you return," he said. The words a rote formality, rather than a genuine instruction. "Understood," Jalen replied, already stepping into the airlock chamber with Cyrene close behind. The inner door sealed behind them, and the decontamination sequence began, a standard procedure for anyone exiting the dome. Cool mist filled the chamber, coating their skin and clothing with a protective layer designed to shield against the most immediate environmental hazards. As the mist dissipated, Jalen met Cyrene's gaze. This was their last moment of relative safety. Once that outer door opened, they would be committed to their escape, facing whatever dangers lay in the transition zone. "Ready?" he asked, an echo of her earlier question. She nodded once. That familiar, decisive gesture that had come to mean so much in their short time together. "Together," she said, the word both acknowledgement and promise. The outer door began to cycle open, revealing the harsh landscape beyond the dome, swirling dust and dim light, the distant outline of rocky formations emerging from the haze. The transition zone, not quite the deadly environment of the open wasteland, but far from hospitable. They stepped out together, the door sealing behind them with a finality that marked the true beginning of their journey. The air was thin but breathable, laden with particulates that immediately coated their skin and clothing with a fine layer of gritty dust. The temperature was significantly colder than inside the dome, but not immediately lethal. A small mercy. "East," Jalen said, orienting himself by the dome at their backs and the faint glow of the distant sun through the haze. "Ridge Camp lies beyond that formation." He pointed to a jagged silhouette on the horizon. Cyrene scanned the landscape with those alien eyes, taking in details that Jalen could only guess at. "Many tracks," she observed. "Regular travel this way." It was an encouraging sign. If others routinely made this journey, their path might be safer than feared. They set off at a steady pace, conserving energy for the long trek ahead. The stolen MK uniforms provided some protection against the cold and dust. But both knew they weren't designed for prolonged exposure to the transition zone environment. As they walked, the dome receded behind them, its massive glass and steel structure gradually shrinking from dominating presence to distant landmark. Jalen found himself resisting the urge to look back, to reassure himself that the only home he'd known for years was still visible. "Thinking of dome?" Cyrene asked, her melodic voice carrying easily in the still air, despite their exertion. Jalen nodded. "Strange to leave it behind," he admitted. Even knowing what it was, what it had become. "Not home," Cyrene said with simple certainty. "Shelter only." The distinction resonated with Jalen. Shard's Edge had provided the basic necessities for survival, but never comfort, never belonging, never the intangible qualities that transformed shelter into home. "What was your home like?" he asked, partly from genuine curiosity, partly to distract them both from the physical demands of their journey. Cyrene was silent for several steps, and Jalen wondered if she would answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a depth of emotion he hadn't heard before. "Waterworld," she said. "Floating cities, light through waves, always moving, always changing. Music in the currents." The image was so unexpected, so contrary to the sterile functionality of Shard's Edge, that Jalen could barely imagine it. A place defined by fluidity and sound, rather than rigid structures and silence. "It sounds beautiful," he said inadequately. "Was," she agreed, a finality in the single word that told him not to press further. Whatever had happened to that world, war, environmental collapse, economic failure, was a wound not yet ready to be examined. They continued in companionable silence, the rhythm of their footsteps creating a steady counterpoint to the occasional whistle of wind through the rocky formations they passed. The landscape grew more varied as they moved farther from the dome, transitioning from flat, dusty plains to rolling terrain with scattered vegetation, hardy plants that had adapted to the harsh conditions. By Jalen's estimation, they had covered nearly half the distance to Ridge Camp when Cyrene suddenly stopped. Her head tilted in that now familiar gesture of focused attention. "What is it?" Jalen asked, instantly alert. "Engine sound," she replied, pointing to their right, where the terrain dipped into a shallow valley. Coming closer. Jalen strained his ears but could detect nothing beyond the ambient sounds of the transition zone. "MKs?" he asked, tension coiling in his muscles. "Unknown," Cyrene said, already moving toward a cluster of rocks that offered minimal cover. "Hide until identified." They crouched behind the rocks, weapons ready, watching the direction Cyrene had indicated. Minutes passed before Jalen finally heard what her superior senses had detected earlier: the distinctive whine of a ground transport's engine laboring over rough terrain. A vehicle crested the ridge across the valley, dust billowing behind it. It was a modified rover, its once sleek lines now augmented with makeshift armor and additional cargo space. The markings on its side were unfamiliar to Jalen. Not MK security, not Dome administration. Scavengers, he guessed, watching as the rover made its way along what appeared to be a well-used track. Probably heading to or from Ridge Camp. Cyrene studied the approaching vehicle with narrowed eyes. "Opportunity," she said after a moment. Faster than walking. Jalen understood her logic immediately. If the rover was indeed bound for Ridge Camp, hitching a ride would save them hours of difficult travel and increase their chances of reaching safety before any pursuit from Shard's Edge could catch up. But it was a risk. Scavengers were notoriously unpredictable, loyal only to whoever paid best. They might help travelers in exchange for goods or information, or they might rob them and leave them to die in the wasteland. "Your call," Jalen said, deferring to Cyrene's sharper instincts. "Stop them or stay hidden." She considered for only a moment before reaching a decision. "Stop," she said, rising from their cover. "Show weapons but no threat. Negotiate." Jalen followed her lead, emerging from behind the rocks with his stolen MK weapon held visibly but pointed downward, a posture that communicated capability without immediate hostility. The rover slowed as it approached, the driver clearly having spotted them. It came to a stop about 20 meters away, engine still running, ready for a quick departure if necessary. A window lowered, and a weathered face peered out. A woman with skin tanned to leather by sun and wind. Her age indeterminate beneath the layers of environmental protection and hard living. "MKs don't usually patrol this far out," she called, her voice carrying the distinctive rasp of someone who had breathed too much transition zone dust. "You lost or desperate?" "Desperate," Jalen replied honestly, deciding that partial truth was their best approach. "Need transport to Ridge Camp? Can pay." He held up one of the MK communicators they had taken, a valuable piece of technology outside the dome. The woman's eyes narrowed as she assessed them more carefully, taking in the details that didn't quite fit: the altered uniforms, Cyrene's unmistakably alien features despite their attempts at concealment. "You're runners," she said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. "From the dome." Jalen tensed, but Cyrene stepped forward, her posture relaxed yet dignified. "Yes," she confirmed. "Seeking new start. No trouble for you." The woman snorted, a sound that might have been amusement or derision. "Trouble follows dome runners like stink follows carrion," she said. "But your credit spends same as anyone's." She jerked her thumb toward the back of the rover. "Climb in. Payment on arrival." Relief washed through Jalen, though he maintained his cautious stance until they had secured their position in the rover's cargo area. The space was cramped, filled with scavenged parts and sealed containers of unknown contents. But it was transportation. As the rover lurched into motion, following the worn track toward Ridge Camp, Cyrene leaned close to Jalen, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. "Trust?" she asked simply. Jalen glanced toward the front compartment, where their driver was focused on navigating the increasingly rough terrain. "Limited," he replied quietly. "But aligned interest for now." She wants payment. We want transport. Cyrene nodded, settling more comfortably against a secured crate, but keeping one hand near her weapon. Rest, she advised. I watch. Exhaustion swept over Jalen as the adrenaline of their escape began to fade. They had been moving continuously since the confrontation with the MKs, with no time for recovery or proper rest. Cyrene's offer to keep watch was tempting, especially given her demonstrated combat abilities. Wake me if anything changes, he said, allowing his eyes to close as the rover's steady motion lulled him toward sleep. We'll protect, Cyrene promised, the words following him into darkness. When Jalen woke, the quality of light had changed, dimmer, redder, as the sun descended toward the horizon. The rover had stopped moving, and for a moment, disorientation gripped him. Arrived! Cyrene's voice came from beside him, her hand on his shoulder. Ridge camp. Jalen sat up, blinking away sleep and taking in their surroundings. The rover was parked among several similar vehicles at the edge of what appeared to be a settlement, a collection of structures that ranged from permanent buildings, constructed of salvaged materials, to temporary shelters that could be dismantled and moved as needed. Ridge Camp was aptly named. It sat on a natural elevation, a ridge of rock that provided both defensive advantage and shelter from the worst of the transition zone winds. Unlike the regulated sterility of Shard's Edge, this place was chaotic, organic, alive with movement and sound. The driver appeared at the back of the rover, gesturing for them to disembark. End of the line, she said. Payment due. Jalen handed over the MK communicator, which the woman examined with expert eyes before nodding in satisfaction. Fair trade, she acknowledged. Word of advice? Ditch those uniforms fast. MKs have contacts even out here. Understood, Jalen said. Any suggestions for shelter? The woman jerked her thumb toward a squat building near the center of the settlement. Finn runs the assignment board. Might have work that comes with housing. Tell him Marta sent you. Without waiting for thanks, she turned back to her rover, already focused on unloading her legitimate cargo. Jalen and Cyrene made their way through Ridge Camp, drawing curious glances, but no outright hostility. The settlement's population was diverse. Humans predominated, but there were other species as well, some familiar to Jalen, others completely unknown. All shared the weathered look of those who lived hard lives in harsh conditions. The building Marta had indicated was constructed of dome panels, repurposed and reinforced with local stone. A crudely painted sign designated it as Hub Central. Inside, the space was divided between a common area filled with mismatched furniture and a more organized section where digital displays showed scrolling information. A man stood at a central console, his attention on the data flowing across his screen. He was tall and lean, with the efficient movements of someone who wasted no energy on unnecessary motion. When he looked up at their approach, Jalen was struck by the intelligence in his dark eyes. MKs don't usually come calling at Ridge Camp, the man said mildly, though Jalen didn't miss the way his hand moved to rest near what was almost certainly a concealed weapon. Not MKs, Jalen clarified quickly. Just borrowing the uniforms. Marta sent us. Said you might have work with housing. The man, Finn, presumably, studied them with renewed interest, his gaze lingering on Cyrene's partially concealed alien features. Runners from the dome, he surmised, much as Marta had. What skills? I was an architect, Jalen said, the admission feeling strange after so long avoiding any mention of his past. And control systems operator. I fix things, Cyrene added simply. Mechanics, electronics, systems. Find errors. Finn's expression shifted from cautious to considering. Architect, he repeated, focusing on Jalen. Structural design, material efficiency? Yes, Jalen confirmed. It was my specialty before. He gestured vaguely, encompassing all that had happened to bring him to Shard's Edge, and now to Ridge Camp. "And you," Finn continued, turning to Cyrene. "What species?" "Cerulean," she replied without hesitation. "Third quadrant." Recognition flickered in Finn's eyes. "Water dwellers," he said. "Adapted to pressure and current systems." He nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "We might have use for both of you." He turned back to his console, fingers moving rapidly over the interface. "Got a prefab unit on the east side," he said. "Basic but functional. Previous occupant left for the agricultural domes last month." He glanced up. "It's yours if you work. First assignment starts tomorrow, dawn shift." "What's the work?" Jalen asked, hardly daring to believe their luck. "Expansion project," Finn explained. "Ridge Camp is growing. Need proper design, not just slapped-together shelters. And our environmental systems need constant maintenance." He looked at Cyrene. "Your kind have good instincts for flow patterns, right?" She nodded once. "Natural affinity," she confirmed. "Perfect," Finn said, making a final entry in his system. "Unit E17. Code is 7391 for now. You can change it once you're settled." He reached beneath the counter and produced 2 simple identifier bands. "Wear these. Mark you as Ridge Camp workers, not visitors. Less questions that way." Jalen accepted the bands, passing one to Cyrene. "Thank you," he said, sensing there was more to Finn's ready acceptance than mere need for their skills. A slight smile crossed Finn's weathered face. "Thank me by doing good work," he said. "And maybe someday by telling me what you did to get the MKs on your tail." At Jalen's startled look, he added, "Marta's got a good eye for trouble. Says you two move like people expecting pursuit." "We disabled 3 of them," Cyrene said matter-of-factly, before Jalen could formulate a more diplomatic response. "They sought me as property. We refused." Finn's eyebrows rose, but the smile remained. "Well," he said after a moment, "that explains the uniforms, and why you might want to change clothes before exploring the rest of the camp." He gestured toward a side door. "Supply depots that way. Basic necessities available on credit against future work, within reason." "Understood," Jalen said, still processing the ease with which they had found shelter and potential employment. In Shard's Edge, nothing came without strings, without suspicion, without cost beyond the stated price. As they turned to leave, Finn called after them, "One more thing." When they looked back, his expression had grown serious. "Ridge Camp doesn't have many rules, but the ones we have matter. Everyone works. Everyone contributes. No one owns anyone else." His gaze fixed on Cyrene. "You're not property here. Remember that." She straightened slightly, those black eyes meeting his directly. "Will remember," she said, the musical quality of her voice more pronounced. "Will contribute." Finn nodded once, satisfied, and returned to his console. Outside Hub Central, the settlement was transitioning from day to evening activities. Lights came on in structures and along pathways, creating pools of illumination in the gathering dusk. Unlike the perpetual twilight of Shard's Edge, here the natural cycle of day and night was preserved, embraced even. They followed Finn's directions to the supply depot, where they exchanged their stolen MK uniforms for more practical Ridge Camp attire, durable work clothes designed for the transition zone environment. Cyrene's new clothing included a hooded component that could shield her distinctive features if necessary. Though Jalen noted with interest that she seemed less concerned with concealment here. Their new prefab unit, E17, was located on the eastern edge of the settlement, as promised. Unlike the identical units in Shard's Edge, this one showed evidence of individual modification and care. A small, covered entrance had been added to the standard design, providing a buffer zone between the harsh outside environment and the living space. Windows had been enlarged and reinforced, suggesting the previous occupant had valued light and views. Inside, the space was larger than Jalen's unit in the dome, divided into discrete areas for living, sleeping, food preparation, and hygiene. The furnishings were simple but functional, salvaged from various sources but arranged with consideration for comfort and use. Better than expected, Cyrene observed, moving through the space with her characteristic efficiency, examining systems and structures with practiced eyes. Much better, Jalen agreed, setting down their supplies and allowing himself to truly relax for the first time since the MKs had appeared at his door. It's actually designed for living, not just existing. Cyrene nodded, completing her inspection of the prefab's environmental controls. Systems well maintained, she reported. Previous occupant careful, respectful of function. Something about her assessment resonated with Jalen. The idea that care for one's surroundings reflected more than mere practicality. It spoke to values, to a way of engaging with the world that had been all but impossible in Shard's Edge. As night fell completely, they shared a simple meal from their supplies, supplemented by basic staples provided with the prefab. The rhythm of their interaction had an easy familiarity now, born of shared danger and common purpose. Tomorrow, Cyrene said as they finished eating, new work begins. New life begins, Jalen amended, surprising himself with the optimism in his voice. If the MKs don't find us. Cyrene considered this, her head tilting slightly. Risk exists, she acknowledged, but diminishing. Distance. Different authority here. Finn, protective of workers. Her assessment was logical, as always, but Jalen sensed there was more she wasn't saying. You're not worried? Worried is unproductive, she replied after a moment. Aware is better. Prepared. She gestured to the weapons they had placed within easy reach of the sleeping area. We'll defend if necessary. We'll adapt if possible. It was a philosophy born of survival, Jalen realized. A refusal to expend limited energy on fears that might never materialize, coupled with pragmatic readiness for dangers that did arrive. He found himself admiring it, wishing he could embrace such clarity. I'll try to be aware, not worried, he said, offering a small smile. Something shifted in Cyrene's expression, a softening around those alien eyes, a slight relaxation of her perpetually correct posture. You learn, she said, and there was warmth in her musical voice. Adapt well for human. The gentle teasing, for that was what it was, Jalen realized with surprise, created a moment of connection that transcended their different species, their different experiences. In that moment, they were simply two beings who had chosen to face danger together, rather than safety apart. We should rest, Jalen said, suddenly aware of the exhaustion that pulled at his limbs and clouded his thoughts. Dawn shift tomorrow. Cyrene nodded, rising with her usual fluid grace. She paused, looking at the sleeping area with its single large bed, clearly designed for human occupants, but more spacious than the narrow cot in Jalen's dome prefab. I will take floor, she said, moving toward the spare bedding they had acquired from the supply depot. There's room, Jalen found himself saying. If you're comfortable with that. She turned to look at him, those bottomless black eyes unreadable. Certain. Yes, Jalen said simply. We've fought together. We've run together. We can certainly rest together. After a moment of consideration, she nodded, setting aside the extra bedding. Efficient, she said. But there was something in her tone that suggested the logical justification wasn't her only consideration. They settled onto the bed, maintaining a careful distance between them, each acutely aware of the other's presence. Despite his exhaustion, Jalen found himself listening to Cyrene's breathing, to the subtle differences in rhythm and depth that marked her as not human. Jalen, she said softly, when he had thought she was already asleep. Thank you. The simple words carried a weight of meaning that needed no elaboration. Thank you for stopping, for sharing food, for fighting, for running, for seeing me as a person, not property. Thank you too, he replied, equally soft. For everything. In the darkness, he felt her shift slightly closer. Not quite touching, but near enough that he could sense the warmth of her presence. It was, he realized, the most profound comfort he had experienced in years. Sleep came easily after that, deep and untroubled by the dreams of cold and isolation that had plagued him in Shard's Edge. Morning arrived with natural light streaming through the prefab's windows, the first genuine sunrise Jalen had seen since arriving at the dome. The quality of it was different, filtered through the transition zone's atmospheric haze, but still unmistakably real, unmistakably alive in a way the dome's artificial dawn never was. Cyrene was already up, moving quietly through their new space, preparing a simple breakfast from their supplies. She had adapted her clothing to better suit her needs, modifying the standard Ridge Camp attire with careful adjustments that accommodated her slightly different physiology. "Good morning," Jalen said, watching her efficient movements with appreciation. She turned, and the expression on her face caught him off guard. There was a lightness there, a subtle relaxation of the vigilant tension she had maintained even in sleep back in Shard's Edge. "Yes," she agreed, gesturing toward the window and the natural light. "Good morning." They prepared for their first work shift with a sense of purpose that went beyond mere obligation. This was not the grim necessity of Jalen's control station duties in the dome. This was contribution to a place that might, with time and effort, become something like home. Finn was waiting at Hub Central, along with several other workers assigned to the expansion project. He introduced Jalen as a structural specialist and Cyrene as a systems engineer, terms that elevated their skills beyond the mere survival functions they had served in Shard's Edge. The project itself was ambitious, an extension of Ridge Camp's living quarters into a naturally sheltered area of the Ridge, incorporating both prefabricated elements and local materials. Jalen found himself consulted on design decisions, his expertise valued rather than exploited. Cyrene worked primarily on the environmental systems, her natural affinity for flow patterns proving invaluable in creating efficient heating, cooling, and air circulation. Days passed, then weeks, each one establishing a new rhythm of work, rest, and gradually expanding connections with other Ridge Camp residents. The prefab unit began to reflect their presence, Jalen's architectural sketches pinned to walls, Cyrene's collection of mechanical components, arranged with precise care on improvised shelving. They spoke sometimes of Shard's Edge, of the life they had left behind, but increasingly, their conversations turned to the present and future, to possibilities rather than losses. It was during one such conversation, as they sat together reviewing Jalen's designs for a communal gathering space in the expansion area, that he realized how much had changed between them. "Structure here," Cyrene was saying, pointing to a section of the design. "Creates shadow pattern, cooling effect in summer, warmth retention in winter." Jalen nodded, making adjustments to the draft. "Good catch," he said. "I was thinking only of the structural support." "Complementary thinking," Cyrene observed. "You see bones, I see breath." The poetic nature of her statement caught Jalen by surprise. In their early interactions, Cyrene had been relentlessly practical, her speech pared down to essential information. Now, increasingly, she expressed concepts with metaphor and nuance. "We make a good team," he said, looking up from the designs to find her watching him with those fathomless black eyes. "Yes," she agreed softly. "Good team." Something in her tone made Jalen pause, sensing unspoken meaning beneath the simple affirmation. "Cyrene," he began, uncertain how to frame the question forming in his mind. "Are you happy here?" Her head tilted in that familiar gesture of consideration. "Happy," she repeated, as if testing the concept. "Yes, work useful, place safe, She paused, then added more quietly, "You hear?" The simple addition transformed her statement from a practical assessment to something far more personal. Jalen set aside the design materials, turning to face her fully. "I'm glad you're here too," he said, the words inadequate for the depth of feeling behind them. "These past weeks, they've been better than anything I've known in years." Cyrene nodded, her expression solemn yet somehow vulnerable. "Same," she said simply. "Better." There was a moment of charged silence between them, filled with all the things neither quite knew how to express. Then, with characteristic decisiveness, Cyrene closed the distance between them, her slender blue-tinged hand coming to rest lightly on Jalen's. The contact was electric, unexpected despite the growing closeness between them. Jalen looked down at their joined hands, hers smaller, with a subtle iridescence to the skin that caught the light, his larger, calloused from weeks of physical work on the expansion project. Different, yet fitting together with a rightness that defied explanation. "Cyrene," he said, her name a question and answer both. She met his gaze steadily, those alien eyes somehow conveying emotions that transcended species differences. "Jalen," she replied, the musical quality of her voice pronouncing his name like a melody. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw. He raised his free hand to her face, fingers gently tracing the curve of her cheek. Her skin was cooler than human standard, with a silken texture that reminded him of water flowing over smooth stones. She leaned into his touch, her eyes half closing in a gesture of trust and acceptance that spoke more eloquently than words. "Not expected," she murmured, when standing in cold, selling self for warmth. "No," Jalen agreed, his voice equally soft. "I never expected to find you, to find this." In the quiet of their prefab, with the natural light of evening painting everything in warm amber hues, they moved toward each other as if drawn by some invisible force. The kiss, when it came, was gentle, an exploration of difference and similarity, alien and familiar all at once. Her lips were cool against his, the slight mineral taste unexpected, but not unpleasant. When they parted, Cyrene's expression held wonder mingled with certainty. "Right," she said simply. "This is right." And it was, Jalen realized. Despite every improbability, every obstacle, every difference between them, this connection felt more genuine than anything he had experienced in his life before, even before Shard's Edge had stripped away his former identity and left only survival instincts in its place. "Stay with me," he said, the words both plea and promise. "Not just until you find passage off-world. Stay." Cyrene's hand tightened on his, her dark eyes unwavering. "We'll stay," she said, the simple declaration carrying the weight of a vow. "Have found home." The word hung between them, precious and powerful. Home. Not just shelter, not just safety, but belonging, connection, purpose beyond mere survival. Jalen pulled her close, his arms encircling her slender form with gentle reverence. She fit against him as if designed to be there, her head resting naturally against his shoulder, her arms finding their place around his waist. They remained that way for a long time, no words needed in the quiet communion of two beings who had found in each other what the harsh world had tried to take from them both: hope, dignity, the capacity for tenderness in a universe of cold calculation. When they finally separated, it was only to move their conversation to the comfort of their shared bed, sitting side by side with hands still linked, unwilling to relinquish the physical connection now that it had been established. "Tell me about your world," Jalen said, genuinely curious about the water planet Cyrene had mentioned only briefly before. The floating cities, the light through waves. Something like pain flickered across her features, quickly controlled, but not before Jalen noticed it. "Lost now," she said quietly. Oceanic rise, temperature change, cities, submerged beyond habitable depth. Understanding dawned slowly. Your people had to leave, he said, pieces falling into place. That's why you were on that ship. Cyrene nodded, her expression solemn. Evacuation vessel, she confirmed. Many ships, many directions, seeking new worlds with water, with depths. I'm sorry, Jalen said, knowing the words were inadequate for the magnitude of loss they attempted to address. Past, Cyrene said, with that pragmatic acceptance that was so much a part of her nature. Cannot change, can only move forward. She looked around their prefab, at the evidence of their shared life taking root. Find new home, create new memories. Her resilience humbled Jalen, who had spent years nursing private grievances about his own losses, the career destroyed, the comfortable life abandoned. Compared to the complete loss of a homeworld, his hardships seemed almost trivial. We'll make new memories, he promised. Better ones. She smiled then, a rare, full expression that transformed her alien features into something transcendently beautiful. Already begun, she said. They talked long into the night, sharing more of their histories, their hopes, their plans for the future. Cyrene spoke of cerulean traditions and beliefs, of the musical language that human vocal structures couldn't fully reproduce, of the deep connection to flowing water that was encoded in her species' very biology. Jalen described his former life as an architect, the satisfaction of creating spaces that nurtured and inspired, the dreams he had abandoned but now found returning. When sleep finally claimed them, it was in each other's arms, a closeness that felt both new and somehow ancient, as if they had been moving toward this moment since the first time their paths crossed in the cold streets of Shard's Edge. The next morning brought a return to their work on the expansion project, but with a subtle difference that others couldn't help but notice. There was a synchronicity to their movements, a silent communication that required no words, an awareness of each other's position and needs that spoke of deep connection. Finn, ever observant, commented on it as they reviewed the day's progress. You two have settled in well, he said, his tone casual, but his eyes shrewd. Found your rhythm here. Yes, Jalen agreed simply, exchanging a glance with Cyrene that said more than words could convey. We have... Finn nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his weathered mouth. Good, he said. Ridge Camp needs people who put down roots, who build for the future, not just the present. The future? It was a concept that had seemed pointless in Shard's Edge, where each day was merely an exercise in delaying the inevitable collapse. But here, in Ridge Camp, with Cyrene at his side, Jalen found himself thinking in terms of years, of growth, of possibilities. Their life together fell into a pattern of work and rest, of public contribution and private connection. The prefab became truly theirs, modified and personalized to reflect their combined sensibilities. Jalen added a small drafting area where he could work on designs during off hours. Cyrene created a workspace for her mechanical projects, salvaged components transformed into useful tools and devices. In the wider community of Ridge Camp, they found unexpected acceptance. Jalen's architectural expertise was increasingly valued as the expansion project progressed, his designs incorporating both practical considerations and aesthetic elements that had been absent from the settlement's earlier, more utilitarian structures. Cyrene's mechanical abilities made her sought after for repairs and improvements, her alien perspective often providing innovative solutions to persistent problems. 3 months after their arrival, as they sat together on the small covered porch they had added to their prefab, watching the transition zone sunset paint the sky in surreal colors, Cyrene broke a comfortable silence with an unexpected question. Jalen, she said, her musical voice thoughtful, what is wife in human custom? The question caught him off guard. his cup of tea pausing halfway to his lips. Wife? He repeated. It's a partner in marriage. A formal union between people who commit to sharing their lives. He set the cup down, turning to look at her. Why do you ask? Cyrene's expression was serious. Those dark eyes focused on him with characteristic intensity. Heard term today. From Marta. She said, How is your wife? I did not correct misunderstanding. A warmth spread through Jalen's chest, a feeling too complex to name. And how did you respond? He asked, his voice soft. Said you were well, Cyrene replied simply. Was this wrong? Jalen shook his head slowly, reaching for her hand. No, he said. Not wrong at all. In Cerulean culture, Cyrene continued, her fingers twining with his. We have concept. Closest translation is current partner. One who moves in same direction, creates shared flow. That's beautiful, Jalen said, genuinely moved by the imagery. And very fitting. Cyrene nodded, a slight smile touching her lips. Think wife is similar meaning, she said. But human term. Would you... Jalen began, then paused, gathering his thoughts. Would you want that? To be considered my wife? For me to be considered your husband? She tilted her head, considering the question with her usual thoroughness. Human custom requires ceremony? She asked. Official recognition? Traditionally, yes, Jalen acknowledged. But the meaning is in the commitment itself, not the ceremony. The choice to build a life together. Cyrene was quiet for a moment, her gaze shifting to the sunset, and then back to Jalen's face. Have already made that choice, she said with certainty. When stayed after repairs completed, when fought MKs together, when left Dome together. Her hand tightened on his. Already committed. The simple truth of her words struck Jalen with unexpected force. She was right. Their commitment had not begun with words or ceremonies, but with actions. The choice to help, to trust, to protect, to build together. Then you already are my wife, he said softly. In every way that matters. Something shifted in Cyrene's expression. A deepening, a settling. As if a question long held had finally found its answer. And you are my husband, she said. The term, slightly unfamiliar on her tongue, but spoken with unmistakable conviction. My current partner. My home. The kiss they shared in that moment held all the promise of their intertwined futures, different paths converging into a single flow, carrying them forward together into whatever lay ahead. As if to test that commitment, the very next day brought the danger they had both known might eventually find them. It began with an alert from the Ridge Camp perimeter sensors, an approaching vehicle, unscheduled and unidentified. Finn summoned them to Hub Central, his expression grave as he gestured toward the monitor displaying the sensor feed. MK transport, he said without preamble. Standard search pattern. They're looking for something. His eyes met Jalen's. Or someone. Tension coiled in Jalen's stomach. But beside him, Cyrene remained calm, her posture alert but not afraid. Expected eventually, she said. Question is, formal request or force? They're stopping at the main entrance, Finn reported, watching the feed. Looks like they're planning to come in through proper channels, at least initially. Options? Jalen asked, mind racing through possibilities. Fight, hide, run again. Finn's weathered face creased in a grim smile. Ridge Camp has its own rules, he said. And one of those rules is that we don't turn over our people to outside authorities without damn good reason. He looked at Cyrene. Especially not when those authorities view sentient beings as property. Relief washed through Jalen, though caution tempered it immediately. They won't accept that easily, he warned. The MKs don't respond well to refusal. No, Finn agreed. turning to a secure cabinet and removing several high-powered weapons. They don't. Which is why we're going to have a little show of force while we negotiate. Word spread quickly through Ridge Camp, residents moving with practiced efficiency to defensive positions. It wasn't the first time the settlement had faced external threats, Jalen realized, watching as shutters were closed. Children moved to central locations, weapons distributed with careful precision. "You two stay here," Finn instructed, handing each of them a compact but powerful energy pistol. "If things go sideways, there's an evacuation tunnel from the back room. Leads to a secondary camp 2 kilometers east." "We won't leave others to fight our battle," Jalen said firmly, checking the weapon with practiced hands. "Not asking you to run from the fight," Finn clarified. "Asking you to be our backup plan. If they take the main camp, someone needs to coordinate the counterattack." His eyes were deadly serious. "You've proven yourselves valuable to Ridge Camp. We protect our own." Before Jalen could respond, the communication system crackled to life. "Ridge Camp, this is MK Security Unit 7, came a hard voice. "We are conducting a search for fugitives from Shard's Edge jurisdiction, requesting permission to enter and investigate." Finn moved to the console, activating the external speakers. "MK Security, this is Ridge Camp Administration. Ridge Camp is an independent settlement outside Dome jurisdiction. What evidence do you have that these fugitives are here?" There was a pause before the response came. "We have tracking data indicating this settlement as a likely destination. We are authorized to use necessary force if cooperation is not provided." "Tracking data?" Jalen murmured, glancing at Cyrene with concern. "How could they—" "Signal from MK uniforms," Cyrene realized, her expression darkening. "Built-in trackers. Should have disabled completely, not just communications." It was a simple oversight, but a potentially deadly one. The uniforms they had discarded weeks ago at the supply depot might have continued to emit a weak signal, enough to narrow the search area, if not pinpoint their exact location. Finn was speaking again, his voice firm, but not overtly hostile. "MK Security. Ridge Camp acknowledges your request, but does not recognize your authority in this territory. If you have specific names and evidence of criminal activity, we can discuss terms for a limited, supervised search." The response was immediate and cold. "This is not a negotiation. We are pursuing stolen property valued at over 50,000 credits. Refusal to cooperate will be considered hostile action." "Property?" Finn's voice remained steady, but his hand tightened on the console edge. "You're pursuing people as property?" One human male, identified as Jalen Rohr, former Dome resident. One Cerulean female, unregistered, classified as salvage under Dome Regulation 47B. Both wanted for assault on security personnel and theft of equipment. Cyrene's expression didn't change, but Jalen felt her tension in the subtle shift of her posture, the coiled readiness to move, to fight if necessary. Finn's response was deliberate, each word weighted with quiet authority. "Ridge Camp does not recognize any sentient being as property. Your classification of the Cerulean individual as salvage violates Interstellar Sentient Rights Accord. Section 12. If you wish to pursue charges of assault, we can arrange for neutral arbitration through the Outer Settlements Council." The silence that followed was tense, stretching for nearly a minute before the MK response came, harder now, with an edge of anger. "You have 10 minutes to produce the fugitives, or we will enter by force to retrieve them." Finn shut off the external communication, turning to the small group gathered in Hub Central. "They'll try to come in through the main entrance," he said, tactical plans already forming. "I want defensive positions at all approach points, but no one fires unless fired upon. Understood?" Nods all around, grim determination on every face. These people, Jalen realized, were prepared to fight for them, for two relative newcomers who had become part of their community. "What can we do?" he asked, stepping forward. "This is our fight." We can't ask others to risk themselves. You became Ridge Camp when you took the work bans, Finn said simply. When you built with us, fixed with us, planned with us, your fight is our fight now. He checked his weapon with practiced efficiency. Besides, the MKs have been pushing boundaries for months. Time they learned we push back. Cyrene moved to Jalen's side, her expression resolute. We'll not hide, she said firmly. We'll defend home. The word resonated through the room. Home. Not just their prefab, not just their workspaces, but Ridge Camp itself. The community they had joined, the future they were helping to build. 7 minutes, Finn noted, glancing at the chronometer. Positions. Everyone. Jalen, Cyrene, North Perimeter. They might try to flank us there while the main force hits the entrance. They moved quickly through the settlement, now eerily quiet, as residents took shelter or defensive positions. The North Perimeter was a natural rock formation, reinforced with salvaged dome panels, providing both cover and a clear line of sight to the approach from that direction. As they settled into position, weapons ready, but not yet aimed, Cyrene spoke quietly. No regret, she said, her eyes on the barren landscape beyond the perimeter. If fighting comes, worth defending. Jalen understood exactly what she meant. After years of merely existing, of surviving without purpose beyond the next day, they had found something worth the risk, worth the fight, not just each other, but the community they had joined, the future they were helping to create. No regret, he agreed, reaching briefly to touch her hand. Whatever happens. The minutes ticked down with excruciating slowness, tension building with each passing moment. Then, just as the deadline approached, movement caught their attention. Not at the main entrance where the MK transport had stopped, but at the North Perimeter they were guarding. 3 figures, Cyrene reported, her alien vision sharper than Jalen's in the fading light. Moving low, armed. Jalen activated his communicator. Finn, we have movement at North Perimeter. 3 hostiles approaching undercover. Confirmed, came the terse reply. Similar reports from east and west. They're trying to surround us while negotiating. Hold position. Do not engage unless they breach the perimeter. The MKs were using standard tactical procedure. Establish a visible presence at the main point of contact, while deploying forces to secondary positions. It was a strategy designed to overwhelm smaller settlements that lacked the resources for comprehensive defense. But Ridge Camp was prepared. As Jalen watched, secondary defensive positions activated, previously concealed barriers rising from the ground, floodlights suddenly illuminating the approaching figures, catching them exposed in the open ground between natural cover and the perimeter. Clever, Cyrene murmured appreciatively. Allowed approach to specific point, created vulnerability. The MKs at the North Perimeter froze, suddenly aware of their exposed position. Through his communicator, Jalen could hear Finn addressing the main MK force at the entrance. Your flanking teams are in targeting range. Finn's voice was calm, matter of fact. Ridge Camp defense systems are now fully activated. I suggest you recall your people and reconsider your approach. There was a tense pause. Then the MK forces at the North Perimeter began a careful retreat, moving back toward cover with weapons still ready, but not engaging. They're pulling back, Jalen reported, watching through the scope of his weapon. All 3, returning to their original position. Similar reports came in from the other perimeter guards, a coordinated withdrawal of the flanking forces, returning to the main transport at the entrance. Minutes later, Finn's voice came through the general communication channel. The MKs are leaving. They've decided Ridge Camp is too much trouble for a simple property retrieval mission. Everyone stay alert until they're beyond sensor range. Relief washed through Jalen, though he maintained his vigilance, watching as the distant figures disappeared into the gathering dusk. Beside him, Cyrene remained equally focused, her posture relaxed but ready. Only, When the all-clear signal finally came, nearly an hour later, did they return to Hub Central, where Finn and the other defenders had gathered to assess the situation. "They'll be back," Finn said without preamble as they entered. "Maybe not tomorrow or next week, but eventually. The MKs don't like losing face." "We should leave," Jalen said, the words painful, but necessary. "Find another settlement, somewhere they won't think to look. We can't put Ridge Camp at risk again." Murmurs of disagreement rose from the gathered defenders. But it was Finn who responded directly, his weathered face set in stubborn lines. "Ridge Camp doesn't abandon its own," he said firmly. "And we especially don't let bullies dictate who can stay and who must go." He looked around the room, meeting each defender's eyes in turn. Today wasn't just about two people. It was about establishing boundaries, about showing the MKs and Shard's Edge administration that their authority ends at the Dome. Nods of agreement, expressions hardening with resolve. These were people who had chosen independence, who had built something outside the failing systems of the domes. They wouldn't surrender that independence easily. "Besides," Finn continued, a slight smile breaking through his serious expression, "we're not done with the expansion project. Can't have our architect and systems engineer running off before it's complete." The tension in the room broke, replaced by determined chuckles and renewed purpose. The danger hadn't passed, not completely, but it had been faced together, and that made all the difference. Later, as Jalen and Cyrene returned to their prefab through the quiet streets of Ridge Camp, a profound sense of belonging settled over them both. This place, these people, had stood with them against a threat, had chosen to protect rather than surrender them. "Home," Cyrene said simply as they reached their door, the single word encompassing all they had found, all they had built, all they would continue to defend together. "Home," Jalen agreed, taking her hand as they stepped inside. That night, as they lay together in the darkness of their shared room, plans began to form in Jalen's mind, not just for the expansion project or for immediate security measures, but for a more distant future, a permanent structure rather than a prefab, a place with room to grow, to change, to become whatever they needed as the years passed. "What are you thinking?" Cyrene asked, her voice soft in the darkness, her body a cool presence against his side. "I'm designing something," Jalen admitted, his fingers tracing patterns on her arm. "A real house, built from the ground up, not assembled from prefab units." She was quiet for a moment, absorbing the implications of his words, the commitment to permanence, to a future measured in decades rather than days or weeks. "Tell me," she encouraged, shifting to see his face in the dim light. And so he did, describing the structure taking shape in his mind. A home built partially into the ridge itself for natural insulation and protection from the harsh transition zone environment. Expanded windows facing east to capture the morning light. A workshop for Cyrene's mechanical projects. A studio for his designs. A garden space where they might grow some of their own food in the improved soil Ridge Camp was developing. "And here," he said, gesturing in the darkness as if the plans were visible before them. "A room that could be whatever we need it to be in the future." Cyrene caught the hesitation in his voice, the careful neutrality that suggested deeper meaning. "A room for child?" she asked directly, with her characteristic forthrightness. "Is this possible?" The question had hovered unspoken between them, the biological reality of their different species, the uncertainty of compatibility. "I don't know," Jalen admitted honestly, "but adoption is always possible. There are children in the domes who need homes, families. If we wanted—" She was silent for a long moment, considering this possibility with her usual thoughtfulness. "Would want," she said finally, "to teach, to nurture, to continue what we build." The simple affirmation filled Jalen with unexpected emotion, joy mingled with hope, possibility expanding beyond what he had allowed himself to imagine in the years of mere survival. "Then we'll include that room," he said, his voice thick with feeling. "For the future." Cyrene's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers twining with his in that now familiar gesture of connection. "Good plan," she said softly. "Good life we build." "The best," Jalen agreed, drawing her closer. "Better than I ever imagined when I found you standing in the cold." She made a sound that might have been a laugh, a musical note of genuine amusement. "Unexpected outcome," she agreed. "Starving alien girl becomes wife." "Future wife," Jalen corrected gently, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And so much more." In the quiet darkness of their prefab, with the sounds of Ridge Camp settling for the night around them, they held each other close. Two unlikely souls who had found in each other not just survival, but purpose. Not just companionship, but love. Not just shelter, but home. And in that home, built from choice and courage and shared vision, they would face whatever challenges came, together, as they had from the moment Jalen had stopped in the cold streets of Shard's Edge and seen not merchandise, not an alien, but a person worth knowing, worth saving, worth loving. In the morning, they would begin drawing plans for their permanent home, would present the designs to Finn for inclusion in the expansion project, would take another step toward the future they were building together, one day at a time. But for now, in the peaceful darkness, they simply held each other, husband and wife in all the ways that truly mattered, current partners moving in the same direction, creating a shared flow that would carry them forward into all the days to come.